September 19, 1945. The war had ended, but hatred still hung thick as Texas dust over Camp Hearn, where 3,000 German prisoners remained locked behind barbed wire, waiting for repatriation ships that never seemed to come. Martha Friedrichs pressed her face against the chain-link fence, watching American soldiers march past with their easy confidence, their careless laughter. She despised them, every single one. They had bombed her beloved Dresden into oblivion, turned her city into a crematorium where her mother and younger sister had perished in the firestorm. The Americans called it liberation. Martha called it murder. She was 23 years old and had been a nurse with the Wehrmacht when Allied forces captured her field hospital outside Aachen. They shipped her across the Atlantic with other female auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, radio operators, women who had served the Reich and now found themselves imprisoned in the sweltering heart of Texas, where the heat felt like punishment from God himself. "Friedrichs," Corporal Davis, one of the camp administrators, shouted through the fence. "You've been assigned to the medical detail. Doctor needs assistance at the civilian hospital in town. You'll be escorted." Martha's jaw tightened. Working alongside Americans, touching their wounded, hearing their drawling voices, it would be torture. But she had no choice. Prisoners who refused work assignments lost privileges, and she'd already spent 2 weeks in solitary confinement for spitting at a guard who'd made a crude joke about German women. The escort arrived 30 minutes later. Martha expected the usual transport truck with armed guards. Instead, a single man appeared, tall, lean, wearing worn denim and scuffed boots, a brown Stetson hat pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't in uniform. He rode a magnificent chestnut horse that snorted and stamped impatiently in the September heat. "You Martha Friedrichs?" His voice carried the slow, melodic drawl of deep Texas. She nodded stiffly, refusing to speak English if she could avoid it. "Name's James Thornton. They hired me to get you to Hearn General Hospital. Town's 8 miles east. We ain't got no truck available today, so you'll be riding with me." He gestured to his horse. Martha stared at him, then at the animal. "Impossible. I cannot ride a horse with you. It is not proper." James Thornton pushed his hat back, revealing sun-weathered features and surprisingly kind blue eyes. "Ma'am, I don't give a damn about proper. It's 98 degrees, and if we don't get moving, we'll both be cooked before we reach town. You can ride behind me, or you can walk 8 miles in this heat wearing that wool uniform. Your choice." According to historical records preserved in the Texas Military Forces Museum archives, Camp Hearn housed German prisoners from 1943 through 1946, with several hundred female auxiliaries among them, a fact often overlooked in standard war histories. Martha wanted to refuse, wanted to stand there in defiant silence until they dragged her back to the barracks. But the heat was unbearable, and she'd seen too much death, too much suffering, to throw away an opportunity to use her medical skills again, even if it meant helping the enemy. "I will ride," she said through gritted teeth. James dismounted with fluid grace and offered his hand. Martha ignored it, attempting to climb up herself. The horse sidestepped nervously and she stumbled. Before she could fall, James caught her elbow, gentle but firm. "Easy now, Ginger, don't know you yet. Let me help." His touch burned through her sleeve like a brand. Martha jerked away, then reluctantly accepted his assistance. He lifted her with surprising ease, settling her behind the saddle before swinging up in front of her. "You'll need to hold on to me," he said matter-of-factly. "I will not." "Suit yourself." He kicked Ginger into a trot, and Martha immediately began sliding sideways. With a gasp of frustration, she grabbed his waist, her fingers clutching the worn fabric of his shirt. She could feel the warmth of him through the thin cotton, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. James Thornton said nothing, but she thought she detected the faintest hint of a smile in his voice when he spoke again. 8 miles, ma'am. Might as well get comfortable. Comfortable. The word seemed absurd. She was a German prisoner, riding through enemy territory, pressed against the back of an American cowboy who probably thought Hitler was the devil incarnate. Her hands touched a man she'd been taught to hate, to fear. Yet as Ginger carried them down the dusty road toward Hearn, past cotton fields stretching endlessly toward the horizon, Martha Friedrichs felt something she hadn't experienced since before the war. A strange, unsettling absence of fear. It terrified her more than any bomb ever had. The landscape rolled past in waves of brown grass and scattered mesquite trees, so different from the green valleys of Saxony that Martha felt as though she'd been transported to another planet entirely. James Thornton rode in silence for the first mile, his body swaying naturally with Ginger's movements, and Martha found herself unconsciously matching his rhythm. "You're German," he said finally, not turning around. It wasn't a question. "Obviously. Dresden?" The word hit her like a physical blow. Her fingers tightened involuntarily against his sides, and she felt him register the reaction. "How did you know?" "Your accent. I was stationed in Germany after VE Day, Leipzig mostly. Met some folks from Dresden. They had the same way of speaking, proper, educated. You sound like them." Martha's throat constricted. "Then you saw what you did to us. The city was filled with refugees, with children. There were no military targets. You murdered 100,000 people in a single night." James was quiet for several heartbeats. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't expected. "I saw what was left, yes, ma'am. I saw the rubble, the melted stone, the shadows burned into walls where people had been standing. I saw children digging through ruins looking for their parents. And yet you feel no shame." "Didn't say that." He adjusted his hat against the glaring sun. "War makes monsters of all of us, Miss Friedrichs. I've seen things done by both sides that'd make the devil weep, but feeling shame don't bring nobody back, and neither does hate." "How dare you speak to me about hate?" Martha's voice cracked with sudden fury. "You Americans, you British, you sit in judgment of Germany, of the Reich, but you committed mass murder. You incinerated women and children. My mother, my sister, they burned alive while you celebrated." She expected him to argue, to defend the Allied bombing campaign, to spout the propaganda about necessary warfare and defeating evil. Instead, James Thornton simply said, "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. Truly I am." The sincerity in his voice disarmed her completely. Martha blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall where this American could witness them. They rode in silence for another mile. The sun beat down mercilessly, and despite her determination to maintain distance, Martha found herself leaning slightly against James's back, seeking whatever shade his body might provide. He didn't comment on it. "Why aren't you in uniform?" she asked finally, desperate to fill the silence with something other than her own turbulent thoughts. Got discharged after Normandy, took shrapnel in my hip during the push inland, still got pieces of German steel in my leg, matter of fact." He said it without rancor, just stating a fact. "After I healed up enough, they sent me home. Been back at my family's ranch since January." "Yet you work for the military prison." "I work for whoever's paying. Ranch don't run itself, and we lost half our hands to the war effort. Money's money, and the Army pays decent for escort work." He paused. "Though I'll admit, when they told me I'd be transporting a German POW, I had my doubts." "Doubts about what?" "About whether I could do it without letting my own anger get in the way. Lost my best friend at Omaha Beach. Watched him bleed out in my arms while German machine guns tore apart everything around us. Took me a long time to not see an enemy every time I heard someone speaking German." Historical accounts from Camp Hearn, documented by the Robertson County Historical Society, reveal that many local Texans were initially hostile to the German prisoners, viewing them as representatives of Nazi atrocities, even as some prisoners themselves had been conscripted soldiers with little love for Hitler's regime. Martha absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the gentle man riding in front of her with the image of a soldier storming the beaches of France. "What changed?" she asked quietly. "Met an old German prisoner working road repair outside town, fellow named Otto. Must have been 60 years old, gray as a badger, hands torn up from breaking rocks all day in the heat. I was delivering water to the work crews, and I saw him collapse. Guards didn't give a damn, figured he was faking to get out of work." James shifted slightly in the saddle, and Martha felt the movement through her hands. "I gave him water, helped him to the shade. He thanked me in broken English, and then—" James's voice softened with something like wonder. "He pulled out this battered photograph of his family. Wife, 3 daughters, all back in Hamburg. Showed it to me like I was an old friend, not a former enemy. Told me he hadn't seen them in 4 years. Didn't know if they'd survived the firebombing." Did they? Don't know. He got shipped back to Germany 2 months ago for repatriation. Hope he found them alive. James cleared his throat. But that day, looking at that photograph, I realized something. Otto wasn't the enemy. Some government officials making decisions in Berlin, some military officers ordering atrocities, maybe they were the enemy, but Otto was just a man who wanted to go home to his family, just like me, just like every other poor bastard who got caught up in this war. Martha felt something crack inside her chest, a fissure in the wall of hate she'd carefully constructed over the past months. They reached the outskirts of Herne by mid-morning, passing modest homes with front porches where elderly women sat fanning themselves, watching with undisguised curiosity as James Thornton rode by with a German woman pressed against his back. Martha could feel their stares, heavy as the humid air, and imagined the conversations that would follow. Did you see that? A Nazi woman right here in town. What's James Thornton thinking? Folks will talk, James said as if reading her thoughts. Small town like this, they ain't got much else to do. Pay them no mind. I am accustomed to hostile looks. I imagine you are. He guided Ginger down Main Street, past the hardware store, the bank, a small diner with red-checked curtains. But for what it's worth, most of the talk will be about me, not you. Folks around here still remember me as the wild Thornton boy who couldn't stay out of trouble. Bringing a pretty German woman into town will just confirm their suspicions that I ain't reformed one bit. Martha felt heat rise to her cheeks, and not from the Texas sun. You should not say such things. What things? That you're pretty? Why not if it's true? Because I am your prisoner, because we are enemies. War's over, ma'am, and you ain't my prisoner. You're my responsibility for the day. There's a difference. He turned Ginger down a side street toward a 2-story brick building with a white cross painted above the entrance. Besides, being enemies don't change facts. The sky's still blue, water's still wet, and you're still pretty. All just observations. Martha didn't know how to respond to this strange American who spoke of prettiness and enmity in the same breath, as though they were equally mundane matters. In Germany, everything had been so clearly defined: friend or enemy, ally or traitor, Aryan or undesirable. The rigid categories had provided certainty, even comfort. But James Thornton seemed to exist outside such definitions, moving through the world with an easy confidence that suggested categories themselves might be meaningless. They reached Herne General Hospital, a modest facility serving the surrounding county. James dismounted first, then reached up to help Martha down. This time, she didn't refuse. His hands circled her waist as he lifted her from the horse, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, they stood close enough that she could see gold flecks in his blue eyes, could smell the scent of leather and horse and something distinctly him. Then the moment passed, and James stepped back, tipping his hat. Dr. Brennan's expecting you. I'll be waiting out here when your shift's done. You're staying? Said I was your escort, didn't I? Can't very well escort you if I ride off. But surely you have other obligations. Your ranch, your work. Ranch'll keep for a day. Besides, Ginger likes the hospital. There's a nice shady spot around back where she can rest. And the nurses sometimes sneak me pie from the cafeteria. He smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face into something almost boyish. Real good pie, too. Apple, mostly. Despite herself, Martha felt her lips twitch toward a smile. She caught herself immediately, forcing her expression back to neutral. I will be working for many hours. I'm patient. Martha turned toward the hospital entrance, then paused. Without looking back, she said quietly, "Thank you. For the ride." "Pleasure's mine, ma'am." Inside the hospital, the familiar smells of disinfectant and illness enveloped her like a memory. Martha followed the signs to the nursing station, where a plump woman with iron-gray hair looked up from a chart with obvious surprise. "You must be the German nurse. I'm head nurse Cassidy. Dr. Brennan's expecting you in examination room 3. She gestured down the hallway, her expression carefully neutral. "We're short-staffed today. One of our girls is out with influenza, and we've got a difficult case. Ranch accident, compound fracture, patients in considerable pain." Martha nodded, falling automatically into the professional demeanor that had sustained her through years of military nursing. Pain and injury transcended nationality. A broken bone was simply a broken bone, regardless of whose body contained it. Examination room 3 held a young man, perhaps 19 or 20, lying on a table with his right leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Sweat poured down his face, and he bit down hard on a leather strap someone had given him. Dr. Brennan, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and intelligent eyes, looked up as Martha entered. "Miss Friedrichs? Thank God. I need someone who won't faint at the sight of bone fragments. This is going to be delicate work." He gestured to the sink. "Scrub up. We need to set this leg before infection takes hold." Records from Herne General Hospital indicate that several German POW medical personnel were utilized during the labor shortage of 1945 and 1946, with many townspeople initially resistant to accepting care from former enemy combatants. Though attitudes gradually softened as the Germans demonstrated professional competence, Martha washed her hands methodically, then moved to assist Dr. Brennan. The next 3 hours passed in focused intensity as they worked to reset the young man's leg, piece together fractured bone, clean the wound, and finally apply a plaster cast. The patient, a ranch hand named Billy, eventually passed out from the pain, despite their best efforts at gentleness, which made the work easier. When they finished, Dr. Brennan peeled off his gloves and studied Martha with new respect. "You're good. Very good. Where did you train?" "Dresden Municipal Hospital, then field hospitals in France and Belgium." "You've seen your share of trauma, then?" "More than my share, doctor." He nodded slowly. "I served in the Pacific, Guadalcanal. Saw things that still wake me up at night." He met her eyes directly. "War reveals what we're made of, sometimes the best in us, sometimes the worst. I try to focus on the best parts, like your skill just now. That young man will walk again because of what you did today." Martha emerged from the hospital as the late afternoon sun painted Main Street in shades of amber and gold. 6 hours had passed since James Thornton had deposited her at the entrance, and she'd worked through them without pause, assisting with 2 additional cases, reorganizing the supply closet using the efficient system she'd developed during her Wehrmacht service, and earning grudging approval from Nurse Cassidy. She expected to find James gone despite his promise. Men made such promises easily, she'd learned. Her own father had promised to come back from the Eastern Front. The last letter had come from Stalingrad in December of 1942, and then nothing but silence that swallowed hope whole. But there was James Thornton, exactly where he'd said he'd be, sitting in the shade with his back against the hospital's brick wall, hat pulled low over his eyes. Ginger stood nearby, contentedly munching grass. At the sound of the door opening, James pushed his hat back and stood with that same fluid grace she'd noticed before. "Good day?" he asked. "Productive." Martha was surprised by how much she meant it. For the first time since her capture, she'd felt useful again, valued for her skills rather than despised for her nationality. "We set a compound fracture, treated 2 cases of heat exhaustion, and delivered a baby." "Busy then." James's eyes crinkled with what might have been amusement. "You hungry? There's a diner down the street. They make a decent chicken fried steak." "I am a prisoner. I should return to camp. Camp dinner won't be served for another 3 hours. You'll be back in time." He tilted his head, studying her. "Unless you'd rather go hungry out of principle." Martha's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, betraying her. She'd eaten nothing since the thin gruel that passed for breakfast at Camp Herne. "It would be inappropriate for me to dine with you in public. Probably. But I'm hungry too, and I ain't inclined to eat alone when there's decent company available. Sides, you earned a proper meal after the work you did today. Dr. Brennan sent word out to me about that ranch hand. Said you saved the boy's leg, maybe his life." "Dr. Brennan did the surgery. I merely assisted." "He said you were the best nurse he'd worked with in 20 years. That ain't merely assisting." James walked to Ginger and began securing his gear. "Come on, my treat. If folks want to talk, let 'em talk. I've survived worse than small-town gossip." Martha knew she should refuse. Every regulation, every propriety, every ounce of common sense screamed at her to maintain distance from this American cowboy who seemed determined to break down her carefully constructed walls. But she was tired, hungry, and, if she was honest with herself, curious about this man who'd waited 6 hours just to ensure she had a ride back to her prison. "One meal," she said firmly. "And then we return to camp immediately." "Yes, ma'am." James grinned, and Martha felt that dangerous crack in her chest widen just a fraction more. The diner, Sally's place according to the hand-painted sign, was a small establishment with a dozen tables covered in blue-checkered oilcloth. A bell jingled as they entered, and conversation stopped as abruptly as if someone had fired a gun. Every face in the diner turned toward them, toward James Thornton and the German woman in a modified prison uniform walking beside him. Martha lifted her chin, refusing to show the fear that fluttered in her stomach. She'd endured far worse than hostile stares. "Afternoon, Sally," James called out to the gray-haired woman behind the counter. "We'll take that corner booth if it's available." Sally's face was a study in conflicting emotions. She'd known James Thornton since he was a boy. That much was obvious from her expression. But she was also looking at Martha with the suspicion reserved for enemies. The war might be over officially, but in the hearts of those who'd lost sons and husbands, it would never truly end. "James Thornton," Sally said slowly. "You sure about this?" "Sure about what? Having dinner?" "You know what I mean. She's German. We got boys from this town who died fighting Germans. We got boys from this town who died fighting Japanese too, but you served that Japanese-American family from Houston last month without comment." James's voice remained easy, but Martha detected steel underneath. "War's over, Sally. She's a nurse who spent the day saving lives at the hospital. I'm hungry, she's hungry, and you make the best chicken fried steak in Robertson County. Now we gonna have a problem?" The diner remained silent. Martha could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Part of her wanted to turn and leave, to spare James whatever social consequences might follow this meal. But another part, the part that had survived the firebombing of Dresden, the part that had endured capture and imprisonment, refused to be driven away by mere disapproval. After a long moment, Sally sighed. "Corner booth. But you're washing your own dishes. Fair enough." James touched Martha's elbow lightly, guiding her toward the booth. As they passed the other tables, conversation gradually resumed, though Martha could feel eyes tracking her movement. They slid into opposite sides of the booth, and Sally brought over 2 glasses of water and plastic menus that had seen better days. "Special today is pot roast," she said, addressing only James. "Be about 15 minutes. 2 specials then, and coffee, please." After Sally retreated to the kitchen, Martha leaned forward, keeping her voice low. "You should not have brought me here. This will cause problems for you. Let me worry about that. Why are you doing this? You do not know me. I am nobody to you, worse than nobody. I am the enemy." James took off his hat and set it on the seat beside him. His hair was slightly flattened from wearing it all day, dark blonde with streaks bleached lighter by the sun. "You asked me earlier what changed my mind about Germans, about the enemy. Let me tell you a story." He wrapped his hands around his water glass, staring down at it as if seeing something far beyond the present moment. "After I got hit at Normandy, they evacuated me to a field hospital. American doctors were overwhelmed, casualties coming in faster than they could handle. There was this one German POW, a doctor they'd captured a week earlier. He could have refused to help, could have done the minimum just to avoid punishment. But he didn't." James looked up, meeting Martha's eyes. "That German doctor worked on me for 3 hours straight, dug shrapnel out of my hip, stopped the bleeding, probably saved my life. And the whole time, he was gentle and careful, like I was his own son or something. When he finished, you know what he said to me?" Martha shook her head, unable to speak. "He said, 'I took an oath to heal, young man. That oath does not recognize uniforms.'" James's voice carried quiet reverence. His name was Dr. Ernst Weber from Munich. He'd been conscripted into the Wehrmacht Medical Corps, spent 3 years treating soldiers in North Africa and France. He showed me a photograph of his own son, boy about my age who'd been killed at El Alamein. Sally returned with 2 steaming cups of coffee, setting them down with deliberate care before disappearing again. Martha wrapped her hands around the cup, grateful for something to hold, something to anchor her to this moment. I asked him how he could treat me with kindness after losing his son, James continued. After all the death and horror, you know what he said? Tell me. He said, because you are not the enemy. You are simply another mother's son who deserves to go home. And right then, lying in that field hospital with pain shooting through my body and the smell of blood thick in the air, I understood something. James leaned forward slightly. The real enemy was never the Germans or the Japanese or whoever else we were told to fight. The real enemy was the hatred that made us willing to keep killing each other long after any rational purpose was served. Martha felt tears prick at her eyes. But we, Germany, we started this war. We invaded Poland, France, Russia. We built the concentration camps. Her voice broke. How can you separate the people from the regime when so many of us followed willingly? Did you follow willingly? The question hung between them like smoke. Martha thought of her younger self at 16, attending the Bund Deutscher medal meetings because everyone did, cheering at rallies because the alternative was suspicion and isolation. She thought of her father, a quiet professor of literature who'd never joined the party, who'd spoken carefully in whispers behind closed doors about the madness consuming their country. She thought of her mother, who'd hidden a Jewish family in their cellar for 8 months before the Gestapo discovered them and sent them all to Theresienstadt. I followed because the alternative was death, she said finally. My family, we were not Nazis. My father hated Hitler, but to speak against the regime was to invite destruction. So we stayed silent. We did what we were told. And our silence made us complicit in things too terrible to speak of. According to testimony recorded in the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, many German civilians and conscripted soldiers struggled with the moral implications of their service to the Reich, with some actively resisting and many more simply trying to survive a totalitarian system that punished dissent with execution. You were a nurse, James said gently. You healed people. That ain't complicity. That's choosing to preserve life in the middle of death. Can't blame yourself for that. But I wore the uniform. I served the Wehrmacht. Martha's hands trembled around her coffee cup. When I was stationed outside Aachen, they brought us wounded SS officers from the Eastern Front. Men who'd committed atrocities, who'd murdered civilians, who'd run the camps. And I treated them. I healed them so they could go back and kill more. How is that choosing life? James was quiet for a long moment. You ever refused to treat someone? Once. The memory surfaced unbidden. An SS Hauptsturmführer, a captain. He'd been bragging to the other wounded about what he'd done to a village in Ukraine, how many people he'd shot personally. The details he gave were... Martha closed her eyes. I told the head doctor I could not treat this man, that to save his life would be to enable more murder. What happened? The doctor agreed with me privately, but he said that if I refused, I would be arrested and likely executed for dereliction of duty. He said that my death would not save the Ukrainian villagers, would not stop the SS captain from recovering with another nurse's help. He said I could die for principle, or I could live and perhaps save someone worthy of saving in the future. Martha opened her eyes, meeting James's steady gaze. So I treated the SS captain. I hated myself for it, but I treated him. And he recovered and was sent back to the Eastern Front, where I assume he killed more innocent people before the Russians killed him. That ain't your sin, James said firmly. That's the sin of the men who gave the orders, who created the system that forced you to choose between your morals and your life. You did what you had to do to survive. Is survival excuse enough? Sometimes survival is the only thing we got, and sometimes staying alive is the most defiant thing we can do. James reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching hers. You're sitting here right now because you chose to survive. Maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe there's good you're meant to do that couldn't have happened if you'd let them execute you for refusing to treat one evil man. Sally returned with 2 plates piled high with pot roast, mashed potatoes, and green beans glistening with butter. She set them down without comment, though Martha noticed the older woman's expression had softened slightly. Perhaps she'd overheard some of their conversation. Perhaps she was simply responding to the obvious emotion in Martha's face. "Eat," James said, picking up his fork. "Food's better when it's hot, and philosophy's better on a full stomach." Martha obeyed, and the first bite of pot roast, tender, savory, seasoned with herbs she couldn't quite identify, tasted like a small miracle. At Camp Hearn, they ate thin soup, stale bread, and occasional stringy meat of dubious origin. This was real food, cooked with care, and she had to blink back tears at the simple pleasure of it. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes. The other diners had returned to their own conversations, though Martha occasionally caught sidelong glances in their direction. Outside, the Texas sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "My sister was 12, Martha said abruptly. "Greta. She loved music, wanted to be a violinist. She'd practice for hours every day, even after the bombing raids started, even when there was barely enough food to keep us alive. She said music reminded her that there was still beauty in the world." James set down his fork, giving her his full attention. "When the British and Americans came with their bombers on February 13th, 1945, Greta was at home with our mother. I was working at the field hospital. The firestorm." Martha's voice caught. "The firestorm created temperatures hot enough to melt stone, hot enough to turn human beings into ash in seconds. My mother and Greta were in the cellar, where everyone said was safe. But the fire consumed all the oxygen. They suffocated before the flames even reached them." "Christ," James breathed. "I'm so sorry." "I returned to Dresden 3 days later, after the fires finally burned out. Our house was gone, just rubble and ash. I found Greta's violin in what had been our cellar, twisted metal strings, the wood body burnt to charcoal. I carried it with me for weeks, even after my capture. It was all I had left of her." "What happened to it?" "An American soldier at the processing center took it from me, said prisoners couldn't have personal items. He threw it in a trash bin with hundreds of other things taken from other prisoners. Photographs, letters, prayer books, wedding rings. All our memories, our connections to the people we'd lost. Just tossed away like garbage." James's jaw tightened. That soldier was wrong. What he did was cruel and unnecessary. He was following orders. Orders can be cruel too. James pushed his plate aside, leaning forward. "Listen to me, Martha. What happened to your mother and sister was a tragedy. An absolute tragedy. No amount of military justification makes it right or makes it hurt less. Those bombers didn't just destroy buildings. They destroyed families, futures, all the potential that your sister carried. And yeah, my country did that. We made the decision to wage total war, to target civilian populations, to break Germany's will by breaking its people." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "But here's the truth that nobody wants to say out loud," James continued, his voice low and intense. "Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides targeted civilians. Both sides convinced ourselves that our cause was righteous enough to justify anything. The Germans bombed London and Coventry. We bombed Dresden and Hamburg. The Japanese slaughtered civilians in China. We incinerated Japanese cities with firebombs and atomic weapons. And at the end of it all, when we count up the bodies of all the mothers and sisters and 12-year-old violinists, what do we have? Victory? Justice? Or just mountains of corpses and oceans of grief?" Martha stared at him, astonished. She'd expected defensiveness, justifications, the usual arguments about Nazi evil requiring extreme measures. Instead, James Thornton sat across from her, acknowledging the unacknowledged. That righteousness was a masked nation's war while committing murder. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "You are American. You won. You are supposed to believe your cause was just. I believe stopping Hitler was necessary. I believe the concentration camps were evil beyond measure, that the Holocaust demanded intervention, that Nazi Germany posed a genuine threat to human civilization." James met her eyes steadily. "But I also believe that incinerating your 12-year-old sister was wrong. Both things can be true at the same time. War can be necessary and still produce outcomes that shame us all." "If you believe this," Why did you fight? Because sometimes you got to choose between terrible options. Sometimes you stand at a crossroads where every path leads through blood, and you pick the path that might lead somewhere better on the other side. He smiled grimly. Don't make it right, though. Just makes it the choice we made. Sally approached their table, coffee pot in hand. Refills? Please, James said. As Sally poured, she glanced at Martha. You're the nurse from the hospital. Yes. My grandson, Billy. He's the one with the broken leg you set today. Dr. Brennan says he'll walk normal again thanks to you. Sally's voice was gruff, but Martha detected genuine gratitude beneath the rough exterior. So I guess I should say thank you, even if you are German. I'm glad I could help, Martha said carefully. Sally nodded, then looked at James. You always did have a soft spot for lost causes and stray dogs, James Thornton. Your mama would be proud of you, even if you do cause more gossip than a Sunday sermon. After Sally departed, Martha asked, Your mother, is she? Died when I was 14. Cancer. Fast and mean. James sipped his coffee. My father raised me and my two brothers on the ranch alone after that. Taught us to work hard, shoot straight, and treat people decent regardless of where they come from or what they look like. He's the one who'll have my hide when he hears I brought a German POW to Sally's diner. He disapproves? Oh, he'll disapprove plenty. He lost his brother, my Uncle Charlie, at Anzio in Italy. German artillery shell. My father's got no love for Germans in general. James grinned suddenly. But he also taught me to think for myself and face the consequences of my thinking. So he'll be mad, and he'll say his piece, and then he'll expect me to do what I believe is right regardless. That's how the Thorntons operate. Martha found herself smiling despite herself. You are a strange man, James Thornton. So I've been told. Usually right before I get punched or kissed, so I've learned it can go either way. The implication hung in the air between them. Dangerous, impossible, and somehow inevitable. Martha felt her cheeks flush and quickly returned her attention to her plate. They finished their meal as twilight deepened outside the diner windows. James insisted on paying despite Martha's weak protests, and Sally gave them a paper bag with 2 slices of apple pie for the road. As they prepared to leave, several of the other diners nodded to James, and one elderly man even tipped his hat to Martha. A small gesture, but one that felt monumental given the hostile silence that had greeted their arrival. Outside, the evening air had cooled to something almost pleasant. James helped Martha mount Ginger, and this time she didn't hesitate before wrapping her arms around his waist. The ride back to Camp Hearn felt different from the morning journey. Less tense, more companionable, as though some invisible barrier had dissolved between them. Can I ask you something personal? James said after they'd ridden in silence for several miles. You may ask. I may not answer. Fair enough. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Do you got someone waiting for you back in Germany? A husband? A sweetheart? Martha's grip tightened involuntarily. There was someone. Hans. We were engaged before the war. He was a medical student planning to become a surgeon. They conscripted him in 1942 and sent him to the Eastern Front. What happened? The same thing that happened to millions of others. He died at Kursk during the tank battles. His last letter reached me 3 months after his death. Mail was slow from Russia. He wrote about the cold, the endless cold, and how he dreamed of summer days in Dresden when we'd walk along the Elbe together. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. He said he was afraid, but that thinking of our future together gave him courage, and then he died before I could write back and tell him I was afraid too. I'm sorry. Everyone is sorry, but sorry does not return the dead. Martha took a shaky breath. After Hans died, I thought I would never feel anything for anyone again. That part of me had died with him in the snow outside Kursk. I thought my heart had frozen just like his body. James said nothing, but she felt the question in his silence. I do not know why I am telling you this, Martha continued. We barely know each other. This morning I hated you simply for being American, and now I do not know what I feel, except that it terrifies me. Feeling things again after you thought you couldn't. Yeah, that's terrifying, James said quietly. After I got wounded, after watching my friends die, I thought I'd never enjoy anything again. Thought the war had killed whatever part of me knew how to be happy. Took me months back at the ranch before I could even smile without feeling guilty about it. Guilty. Survivor's guilt, the doctors called it. Why did I get to come home when Tommy didn't? Why do I get to eat Sally's pot roast and watch Texas sunsets while Jimmy's rotting in a grave in France? Felt wrong to be alive. Felt wrong to enjoy being alive. What changed? My father said something that stuck with me. He said, "Boy, you got two choices. You can honor the dead by dying with them in your heart, or you can honor them by living well with their memory as a compass. But you can't do both, so choose." James adjusted his grip on the reins. I chose living. Figured Tommy and Jimmy would have wanted me to. Figured the best way to honor their sacrifice was to build something good with the life they helped protect. Martha rested her forehead briefly against James's back, a gesture of exhaustion and something else she couldn't quite name. Do you think they would forgive us? Hans, your friends, do you think they would forgive us for finding happiness when they cannot? I think they'd want us to be happy precisely because they can't be. I think they'd want us to love life enough for all of us who made it, and all of us who didn't. James's voice was firm with conviction. And I don't think love is a betrayal of the dead. I think it's the most defiant thing we can do in a world that tried its damnedest to teach us hate. The gates of Camp Hearn appeared ahead, floodlights already blazing in the gathering darkness. Martha felt a familiar dread settle over her. The return to barbed wire and armed guards, to the reality of being a prisoner in a foreign land. But now that reality felt different somehow, less absolute, as though James Thornton had opened a door to possibilities she'd thought permanently closed. James brought Ginger to a halt about 50 yards from the gate, far enough that the guards couldn't overhear their conversation. He dismounted first, then helped Martha down. For a moment they stood close together in the purple twilight, neither quite willing to break the connection. "Will you?" Martha started, then stopped, uncertain how to phrase the question. "Will I be here tomorrow to take you back to the hospital?" "Yes, ma'am. Dr. Brennan requested you specifically for the rest of the week. Seems you made quite an impression." Relief flooded through her, so intense it was almost painful. "I see." "And Martha." James's use of her first name sent a shiver down her spine. "Thank you for trusting me today. I know it wasn't easy. Thank you for being trustworthy." She hesitated, then added softly, "James." His smile could have lit the darkening Texas sky. "Get some rest. I'll be here at 0700. Martha walked toward the camp gates, acutely aware of James watching her go. At the checkpoint, the guard, a different one from the morning, looked her over suspiciously. "You're late. Curfew's in 30 minutes. I was working at the hospital. You can verify with your superiors." The guard grunted but waved her through. As Martha passed into the compound, she glanced back once. James Thornton still sat astride Ginger, silhouetted against the sunset, watching until she was safely inside. Then he touched his hat in farewell, turned his horse, and rode away into the Texas night. Martha made her way to the women's barracks, where her fellow prisoners were preparing for evening roll call. Ingrid, a former clerk from Hamburg who'd become something like a friend, looked up with curiosity. "Where have you been all day? There were rumors you'd escaped." "Working, at the civilian hospital." Martha sat on her narrow bunk, suddenly exhausted. And? How was it? How could she possibly explain? How could she convey that a single day had cracked open her carefully sealed heart, that an American cowboy had shown her more kindness than she'd experienced in years, that she'd shared her deepest grief with a former enemy and found understanding instead of judgment? "It was good," Martha said finally. "The work was good." Ingrid studied her shrewdly. "There's more to it than that. You look different. Lighter somehow." "Do I?" "Yes. Like you remembered how to hope." The following morning arrived with the brutal heat that characterized Texas in late September. Martha woke before dawn, her internal clock still attuned to military precision despite months of captivity. She washed at the communal sink with cold water and a sliver of soap, then dressed in the same modified uniform she'd worn yesterday, now cleaned and pressed as well as circumstances allowed. Ingrid watched her preparations with knowing eyes. "This American escort of yours, what's his name?" "James Thornton." Martha tried to keep her voice neutral. "And he's coming back for you today?" "He is assigned to escort me to the hospital. It is merely duty." "Merely duty." Ingrid's smile was gentle, sad. "Martha, I've known you for 4 months. You haven't looked at yourself in a mirror with that expression since I met you. That's not the face of a woman going to perform merely duty." Martha's hands stilled on the buttons of her uniform. "It is impossible, whatever you're thinking. He is American. I am German. We are human," Ingrid suggested. "Lonely? Alive despite everything that tried to kill us?" Historical records from the National Archives indicate that fraternization between American personnel and German POWs was officially prohibited, though enforcement varied widely, and several documented cases of romantic relationships developed during the occupation period, some resulting in marriages after repatriation. Even if I felt something, which I am not saying I do, what future could there be? I will be sent back to Germany soon. The repatriation ships will come eventually, and I will return to a country destroyed, divided, occupied by foreign armies. Whatever I might feel, it leads nowhere. Perhaps nowhere is still better than the nothing we've been living in, Ingrid said softly. Perhaps a few weeks or months of feeling alive is worth more than years of merely existing. Martha had no answer to that. She finished dressing in silence and made her way to the camp gates, where James Thornton waited precisely at 7 o'clock, sitting astride Ginger with his hat tilted against the rising sun. When he saw her approach, his face transformed into that boyish smile that did strange things to her heartbeat. "Morning, ma'am. Ready for another day of saving lives?" "Good morning, James." The use of his first name came more easily than it should have. "Yes, I am ready." The ride to Hearn General Hospital followed the same route as yesterday, but everything felt different in the morning light. The landscape seemed less alien, the heat less oppressive. They spoke little during the journey, but the silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. The silence of two people who'd already said the important things and were content to simply share each other's presence. At the hospital, Dr. Brennan greeted Martha with obvious relief. "Miss Friedrichs, thank God. We have 3 surgeries scheduled today, and Nurse Cassidy called in sick. I need someone with steady hands and a strong stomach." The day passed in a blur of surgical procedures, patient care, and the familiar rhythms of medical work that transcended language and nationality. Martha assisted with an appendectomy, helped set another broken bone, this time an arm, and spent 2 hours teaching a young American nurse proper suturing techniques. By the time her shift ended, she'd earned respectful nods from the entire hospital staff and a grudging, "You're competent, I'll give you that," from the head surgeon. James was waiting in his usual spot when she emerged, but this time he wasn't alone. An older man stood beside him, tall and weathered, with James's blue eyes and a harder set to his jaw. Martha knew immediately this must be James's father. "Miss Friedrichs," James said, his voice carefully neutral, "I'd like you to meet my father, Robert Thornton. Pa, this is Martha Friedrichs, the German nurse I told you about." Robert Thornton looked Martha up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who'd spent a lifetime evaluating livestock and men and found both frequently wanting. "So you're the German?" "Yes, sir. You're the one who saved Billy Henderson's leg." "Dr. Brennan performed the surgery, I merely assisted. Brennan says you're the best nurse he's worked with in 20 years. Says you got skills he's only seen from surgeons with a decade of experience." Robert's expression remained stern. "He also says you treated 3 of our boys yesterday without a trace of resentment or hostility, even though they're the enemy that destroyed your country." "They are not the enemy," Martha said quietly. "They are patients. Medicine recognizes no borders, no uniforms. Only suffering and the attempt to alleviate it." Robert was silent for a long moment. "My brother died fighting Germans in Italy. Shot by a sniper outside Rome. He was 32 years old, had a wife and 2 children back in Houston. They're still grieving. I am sorry for your loss, sir." "Are you?" Truly? Or is that just what you say because it's polite? Martha met his eyes directly. My mother and 12-year-old sister burned to death in the firebombing of Dresden. My fiancé froze to death at Kursk. My father disappeared at Stalingrad and is presumably dead. My city, my country, everything I knew. All destroyed. So yes, Mr. Thornton, I understand grief. And yes, I am truly sorry for your loss, because I know exactly what loss feels like. Robert's jaw worked as he processed this. Finally, he turned to James. She's got spine, I'll give her that. She does, James agreed. And you're getting attached to her. Don't bother denying it. I can see it in your face, same way I could see it when you brought home that three-legged dog you found on the highway. James's cheeks reddened. Not saying it's wrong, Robert interrupted. Just saying it's complicated. She's a POW. She'll be going back to Germany soon. And even if she wasn't, half the town will have opinions about an American boy courting a German girl, especially one who served the Wehrmacht. I know all that. Do you? Because it's one thing to know something in your head and another to understand it in your gut, when Sally's refusing to serve you breakfast and the pastor's giving you dirty looks at Sunday service. Robert sighed heavily. But your mama always said I raised you boys to think for yourselves, even when it caused me gray hairs. So I won't forbid it. But I will say this. If you're going to pursue this, you better be serious. Don't go breaking this young woman's heart just because you're lonely and she's pretty. Martha felt her face flush hot. Mr. Thornton, I assure you there is nothing improper happening between your son and myself. He is simply performing his assigned duty as my escort. Robert snorted. Young lady, I may be old, but I ain't blind. My son looks at you the way I looked at his mama when I was courting her, and unless I miss my guess, you look at him pretty much the same way. Now what you choose to do about that is your business. I'm just saying, be honest about it, at least to yourselves. With that pronouncement, Robert Thornton nodded once, mounted his own horse, and rode off toward the ranch, leaving James and Martha standing in awkward silence. I apologize for my father, James said finally. He's about as subtle as a stampeding bull. He is protective of you. That is good. He's right though, isn't he? About how I look at you. Martha's breath caught. This was the moment where she should deflect, should retreat behind propriety and impossibility. Instead, she heard herself say, yes, he is right. And about how you look at me. Yes. The single word hung between them, honest and terrifying. James stepped closer, close enough that Martha could see the gold flecks in his blue eyes, could count the days of sun exposure written in the lines around his mouth. This is foolish, Martha whispered. Probably. It has no future. Maybe not. I will be sent back to Germany. I know. So why? Because, James said softly, my father was right about something else too. Better to be honest, at least to ourselves. And the honest truth is that I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since yesterday. The honest truth is that when you climbed off Ginger last night and walked back into that camp, it felt like watching light disappear from the world. The honest truth is that I know this is complicated and probably impossible. But I'd rather have complicated and impossible with you than easy and meaningless with anyone else. Martha felt tears prick at her eyes. James, you don't have to say anything right now. Don't have to make any decisions or promises. I just needed you to know that this ain't casual for me. That whatever this is between us, I'm taking it serious. He stepped back, creating respectful distance. Now, we should probably get you back to camp before curfew. Don't want you getting in trouble on my account. The ride back to Camp Hearn felt shorter than it should have, as though time itself was accelerating toward inevitable separation. The next 3 weeks fell into a pattern that felt both dreamlike and more real than anything Martha had experienced in years. Each morning, James arrived at 0700 to escort her to Hearn General Hospital. Each evening, he waited patiently to bring her back to camp. And in between, they stole moments, conversations during the ride, Shared meals at Sally's diner where the townspeople gradually grew accustomed to seeing them together. Quiet talks in the hospital courtyard during Martha's brief breaks. Dr. Brennan officially requested Martha be assigned to the hospital permanently, citing critical staff shortages. The camp commander approved, either because the medical need was genuine or because he appreciated having one fewer prisoner to supervise. Martha suspected both. She learned about James's life, how his mother had died too young, how he'd raised his youngest brother while his father worked 16-hour days to keep the ranch afloat, how he'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor despite his father's protests, how Normandy had changed him in ways he was still trying to understand. She learned that he loved the ranch, but sometimes felt suffocated by the endless sameness of rural Texas, that he wanted to study veterinary medicine, but couldn't afford the schooling, that he wrote poetry he showed no one and played harmonica badly but enthusiastically. James learned about Martha's Dresden, not the destroyed city of firestorms and rubble, but the living city of her childhood. The Frauenkirche with its magnificent dome, the Semper Opera House where her mother took her to see Mozart, the Elbe riverbanks where young lovers walked on summer evenings. He learned about her father's vast library, her sister's violin recitals, her dreams of becoming a surgeon before the war had derailed every plan she'd ever made. He learned that she spoke 3 languages, that she'd once wanted to work with Doctors Without Borders, that she'd kept a diary since age 10, but burned it before her capture for fear of what incriminating thoughts it might contain. They didn't speak of the future. By unspoken agreement, they existed only in the present, each morning a gift, each evening a borrowed moment stolen from the inevitable. But the present couldn't last forever. On October 15, 1945, camp officials posted a notice. Repatriation ships would begin departing from New York in November. All German POWs would be returned to occupied Germany by year's end. Processing would begin within 2 weeks. Martha read the notice with numb detachment. She'd known this was coming, had known from the beginning that her time in Texas was temporary. Yet knowing something intellectually and facing its reality were entirely different experiences. That evening, when James arrived to escort her back to camp, she handed him the notice without speaking. He read it silently, his jaw tightening with each word. Finally, he folded the paper carefully and handed it back. 2 months, maybe less. Yes. They rode in silence until they were halfway back to camp, following the familiar route through cotton fields gone brown with autumn heat. Then James suddenly pulled Ginger off the main road onto a smaller path that wound through a grove of live oak trees. "Where are we going?" Martha asked. "Somewhere we can talk without guards and gates and time limits." The path opened onto a small clearing beside a creek, barely more than a trickle in the October drought, but surrounded by trees that provided shade and privacy. James dismounted and helped Martha down, then stood facing her with an expression of such intensity it made her heart race. "Marry me," he said. Martha felt the world tilt sideways. "What?" "Marry me, before they send you back. Stay here in Texas, with me." "James, we can't. It's impossible." "Why? Because you're German and I'm American? Because we've only known each other a month? Because the world says people like us shouldn't fall in love?" He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "Martha, I know this is crazy. I know we're moving too fast. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this can't work. But I also know that when I'm with you, I feel more alive than I've felt since before the war. I know that you're the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I think about before I sleep. I know that the idea of you getting on a ship and sailing away while I stay here, it feels like dying. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're brave and kind and brilliant. I know you saved Billy Henderson's leg and taught young Nurse Cooper how to suture and treated every patient at that hospital with respect regardless of who they were. I know you loved your sister enough to carry her twisted violin for weeks. I know you're honest even when honesty hurts. What else do I need to know?" Martha pulled her hands away, turning to face the creek because she couldn't bear to look at his earnest face. "You need to know that I am broken, James. The war broke something inside me that may never heal. You need to know that some nights I wake up screaming, reliving the firebombing, smelling burning flesh. You need to know that I carry guilt for every SS officer I treated, every time I stayed silent when I should have spoken, every compromise I made to survive. You think I don't carry the same weight? James's voice was rough. You think I don't see the faces of the men I killed? You think I don't wake up hearing Tommy scream as he bled out in my arms? We're both broken, Martha. But maybe broken people understand each other better than whole ones. She turned back to him, tears streaming down her face. And what happens when your neighbors refuse to speak to you because you married a German? When your father is ostracized for having a Nazi daughter-in-law? When our children, if we have children, are bullied and called half-breeds and made to pay for sins that weren't theirs, then we'll face it together. And if the neighbors want to be small-minded fools, that's their loss. And my father, he already gave his blessing, in his own rough way. James closed the distance between them. As for children, I hope we have a dozen of them. And yeah, maybe they'll face some hardness, but they'll also have parents who love each other across borders, and despite history, they'll learn that love is stronger than hate, that people matter more than nationality. Seems like a better inheritance than most. James, I love you, Martha Friedrichs. His voice cracked with emotion. I love your strength and your honesty, and the way you care for patients like each one matters personally. I love how you speak 3 languages and dream in German and teach me words I can't pronounce. I love that you're broken and brave and beautiful, and I know it's too soon and too complicated and too many other things. But war taught me that time is precious and tomorrow isn't guaranteed. So I'm asking you now, today, in this moment, will you marry me? Martha looked at this American cowboy who'd somehow seen past uniforms and borders to the woman underneath, who'd listened to her grief without trying to fix it, who'd shared his own brokenness without shame, who'd waited patiently every evening to ensure she got back to camp safely, even when there was no requirement to do so. She thought of Hans, her fiancé who'd died in the snow at Kursk. Would he want her to spend the rest of her life mourning him, or would he want her to live fully, to love again, to honor his memory by embracing joy wherever she found it? She thought of her mother and Greta, burned to ash in Dresden. What would they say if they could speak? Would they tell her to refuse this American's love out of loyalty to their memory, or would they tell her to grab happiness with both hands because life was too short and too fragile to waste? She thought of Dr. Weber's words, the ones James had shared with her. The oath does not recognize uniforms. Perhaps love didn't recognize borders either. Yes, Martha whispered. Yes, I will marry you. James's face transformed with joy. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around in the clearing, while Ginger watched with what seemed like equine approval. When he set her down, he kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper, a kiss that tasted of possibility and promise and desperate hope. The wedding took place on October 28, 1945, in a small chapel outside Herne, with Dr. Brennan and Nurse Cassidy as witnesses. The camp commander granted Martha a 1-day pass after James submitted formal marriage authorization paperwork through proper channels. Robert Thornton attended, wearing his only suit and presenting Martha with his late wife's wedding ring, a simple gold band that fit perfectly, as though fate itself approved. Sally from the diner provided the cake, a modest single-tier affair she'd baked the night before, decorated with late-season wildflowers. Ingrid from the camp received special permission to attend, and she cried through the entire ceremony, happy tears that spoke of hope surviving in the darkest places. The chaplain who performed the ceremony was a Methodist minister named Reverend Walsh, a man who'd served as an army chaplain in the Pacific and seen enough death to appreciate life's rare moments of grace. He spoke briefly about love transcending circumstances, about renewal after destruction, about 2 people from opposite sides of a terrible war choosing to build something new together. Marriage, he said, looking between James and Martha, is an act of faith. Faith that tomorrow will come, that love is stronger than fear, that 2 broken people can create something whole. In a world that's seen too much hate, every marriage is an act of defiance, a declaration that life and love will continue despite everything that tries to destroy them. But this marriage, He gestured to encompass their unlikely union. This marriage is defiance raised to art. Martha wore a simple white dress borrowed from Nurse Cassidy, altered to fit her slighter frame. James wore his best shirt and clean denim, his hair neatly combed but already beginning to rebel against order. They spoke their vows in English and German both, promises that sounded the same in any language: to love, to cherish, to stand together against whatever challenges lay ahead. When Reverend Walsh pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed his bride with a tenderness that made even the stoic Dr. Brennan blink rapidly and turn away. The reception, such as it was, took place in Sally's diner after closing hours. The same townspeople who'd stared with suspicion a month earlier now crowded into the small space, bringing covered dishes and well wishes. Billy Henderson arrived on crutches, his leg in a cast signed by half of Robertson County, and presented Martha with a hand-carved wooden box he'd made himself. "For your hope chest," he said shyly. "Figured every married lady needs one." Sally's grandson had somehow learned of Martha's lost sister and her violin. Inside the box he'd placed a small photograph he'd found at an estate sale. A young German girl holding a violin, smiling at the camera. Not Greta, but close enough to honor her memory. Martha cried then, the kind of tears that wash away old grief while making space for new joy. According to records maintained by the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, approximately 500 marriages occurred between German POWs or displaced persons and American citizens in the years immediately following World War II, though exact numbers are difficult to verify due to incomplete record-keeping and the sensitive political nature of such unions. James and Martha spent their wedding night at a modest hotel in Hearn, one precious night of privacy before Martha's temporary pass expired. They talked until dawn, making plans for the future that had seemed impossible just weeks before. James would work the ranch while Martha, once formally released from POW status and granted proper immigration papers, would continue at Hearn General Hospital. They'd save money for James's veterinary education. They'd build a house on Thornton land with a room overlooking the fields where Martha could paint, a hobby she'd mentioned once and James had remembered. They'd write to displaced persons organizations trying to locate any surviving members of Martha's family. They'd live deliberately, gratefully, as people who'd survived the unsurvivable and found each other in the aftermath. "Do you think it will be difficult?" Martha asked as morning light filtered through the hotel curtains. "Being married to me, I mean, when people remember the war." James traced lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Probably. People have long memories for some things and short memories for others. But here's what I figure. We'll outlast them. We'll be so happy, so obviously right for each other, that eventually even the stubborn ones will have to admit that maybe love don't recognize borders after all. And if they don't, then we'll love each other anyway. We'll build a good life, raise good children, treat people decently, and let our lives speak louder than their prejudice." He tilted her chin up to meet his eyes. "Martha, I didn't marry you to make a political statement or to prove a point. I married you because living without you felt like drowning. Everything else, the complications, the gossip, the challenges, we'll figure it out as we go." Martha's official release from POW status came through in December of 1945, expedited by her marriage to an American citizen and her documented work at a civilian hospital. She moved to the Thornton Ranch just before Christmas, where Robert Thornton gruffly welcomed her while secretly adding extra blankets to her room and ensuring the kitchen was stocked with ingredients for German baking. The first months were an adjustment. Martha learned to cook Texas-style barbecue and chicken fried steak. James learned to pronounce German words and appreciate the subtle differences between Bavarian and Saxon traditions. Robert taught Martha to ride horses properly, not just hanging on behind my son like a sack of flour, and she taught him a card game her father had loved. The ranch hands were initially suspicious, but Martha won them over by working alongside them during calving season, demonstrating that she wasn't afraid of hard work or mess. By spring, they were inviting her to family gatherings and defending her fiercely when anyone in town made disparaging comments. The most difficult moment came in March of 1946, when Martha received word through the International Red Cross that her father had survived Stalingrad after all. He'd been captured by the Soviets and held in a prisoner camp in Siberia. He was alive but trapped in Soviet territory with no clear path to freedom or reunion. Martha wept for 3 days, tears of joy that he lived, tears of anguish that she couldn't reach him. James held her through it all, writing letters to every organization and government office he could find, demanding information about repatriation of German POWs from Soviet custody. It would take 3 more years before Martha's father finally made it back to Germany, and another year after that before he received permission to immigrate to America. But when Heinrich Friedrichs finally stepped off a ship in New York in 1950, James and Martha were there to meet him. The old professor embraced his daughter for the first time in 7 years, then turned to James and said in careful English, "Thank you for keeping my daughter safe. Thank you for giving her a reason to hope." By then, Martha and James had 2 children, a son named Thomas after James's lost friend, and a daughter named Greta after Martha's lost sister. They would eventually have 4 more children, and the Thornton Ranch would echo with laughter in English and German both. Martha never forgot Dresden, never forgot the war, never stopped grieving for those who hadn't survived. But she learned that grief and joy could coexist, that honoring the dead meant living fully, that love was indeed stronger than hate when given room to grow. On their 50th wedding anniversary, in October of 1995, James and Martha sat on the porch of the house they'd built together, watching the Texas sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of orange and gold. Their children and grandchildren filled the yard, a rowdy multilingual collection of Thorntons who embodied the stubborn insistence that love recognizes no borders. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked, his voice rough with age but still carrying that distinctive Texas drawl. "Staying here instead of going back to Germany?" Martha took his weathered hand in hers, the same hand that had helped her onto a horse on a September morning 50 years before. "I regret nothing," she said firmly. "Germany was my home once, and I honor that. But home is not just a place. It is where your heart lives. And my heart has lived with you since the day a Texas cowboy put a German POW on his horse and showed her that enemies can become friends, friends can become lovers, and love can remake the world one unlikely marriage at a time." James kissed her temple, and they sat in companionable silence as the Texas sun set on another day of the life they'd built together. A life that had seemed impossible in 1945, but which had proven gloriously, defiantly real. Behind them, their granddaughter Sophie, named after James's mother, practiced violin in the music room they'd built specifically for that purpose. The melody drifted through the evening air, sweet and perfect, a song of memory and hope, of endings and beginnings, of love surviving everything that tried to destroy it. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, if you listened very carefully, you might have heard the echo of another violin. A 12-year-old girl in Dresden, playing one last song for a sister she'd never meet, but whose choice to love had honored her memory more perfectly than any monument ever could. Author's note: while this story is a work of historical fiction, it draws on documented realities of the post-World War II period. Camp Hearn was a real POW camp in Texas, housing German prisoners from 1943 to 1946. Several hundred marriages between German POWs or displaced persons and American citizens did occur in the immediate post-war years, despite significant social stigma and bureaucratic obstacles. The emotional and psychological experiences of both American veterans and German prisoners described in this narrative are based on recorded testimony from the Library of Congress Veterans History Project and various oral history archives. The bombing of Dresden, on February 13th through 15th, 1945, did result in massive civilian casualties, with historical estimates ranging from 25,000 to 40,000 deaths, though exact numbers remain disputed. This story honors the countless individuals who chose love and reconciliation over continued hatred in the war's aftermath.